Well, it looks like Visions of Mana fans fell for it hook, line, and sinker. Oh, we're totally going to make this game for the Japanese audience, guys. It's not going to be westernized. Oh, by the way, it's not coming out on Nintendo Switch, the most popular platform in Japan. So I can't believe that the audience is too stupid to pick up on this. Like, they're so small brained, they're so low IQ, they can't possibly piece together that, like, I wonder if the main reason these games are getting worse is because they're not releasing on the relevant hardware. You know, like, I wonder if that's why these games aren't doing well. Unicorn Overlord sold like 5 copies on Xbox, if that, and yet you're seeing people try and come out and say that, like, oh, Nintendo Switch, it's losing relevancy, like it's not doing well at all. Like, I saw like one of these Famitsu sales accounts, come out and try to say, oh, Rise of the Ronin outsold Dragon's Dogma 2 this week, Princess Peach Showtime outsold them both. Like, this is the reality that we're in right now, where Japanese developers are desperately trying to steer people away from the Nintendo Switch hardware towards the inferior PlayStation brand, because they know that they cannot compete with Nintendo on their own hardware. You are delusional if you believe that Visions of Mana could not run on Nintendo Switch. You are delusional if you believe Baldur's Gate 3 could not run on Nintendo Switch. You are delusional if you believe Elden Ring could not run on Nintendo Switch. Tales of Arise could run on Nintendo Switch. Like, the reality is that, like, this generation, this console generation has been a farce. Like, I mentioned this in like my tirade last night when I was talking about how third parties have always been undermining Nintendo. Like, we still do not have a port of Grand Theft Auto 5 on Nintendo Switch. And you can't convince me that, like, oh, Switch can't run that because that was a PlayStation 360 game. Like, are you really going to tell me that Switch cannot run Grand Theft Auto 5? Like, why was that not a day one release? In fact, why was that not a day one release on Wii U? Right? Isn't it kind of coincidental that it just doesn't happen for same with Call of Duty. The most popular FPS franchise on the planet, like, it conveniently skips the Switch, right? Bobby Kotick released a statement about this, like, oh, we didn't think the Switch would be successful. Well, okay, but that mindset should have gone away after the first year. Like, why did it not happen? You know, the reality is, like, these companies are desperate to stay off of Nintendo hardware because they know they cannot remain relevant on it. The instant that people become like more aware of what's actually out there, the instant they like play a little bit of things like play anything outside of like the most mainstream basic bitch video games imaginable, like, they'll realize very quickly that Nintendo games are actually better than the competition. We all talk about Zelda and how that's like better than like anything Elden Ring, Skyrim, FromSoft, Bethesda, or Rockstar Games has ever produced, but that extends to a lot of different genres as well. I've been very vocal about my feelings towards strategy RPGs and how Fire Emblem is dominating the niche, even though people don't want to admit it. One of the reasons I went off like on such a tirade about like Unicorn Overlord um, was because this is the best strategy RPG we've ever made. We've gotten in recent years, right? From That's a true multiply in the sense that it did get a Nintendo Switch release. What happened? It sold less than Fire Emblem Engage. It was not as good as Fire Emblem Engage. And people are still in denial about that, and that's fine because I really, really enjoy Unicorn Overlord. But let's not like mince words here. Like, this is a game that took 10 years to make. It's the most high quality product imaginable, and yet it still could not compete with Fire Emblem Engage, right? You have the whole Power World thing, a game whose entire audience, the entire appeal of that game revolves around this idea that like it's gonna replace Pokemon, right? And people completely ignore the fact that, like, this could easily run on Nintendo Switch. The game isn't that good. It's heavily plagiarized. The sales numbers they release are obviously fake. The updates are really slow. Like, there's all these problems with Power World that like people just refuse to talk about purely because they want to downplay the Pokemon brand. They want to downplay Nintendo, right? We've been seeing this with Gamergate too, where like all these companies are doing all of this stuff, right? Sega had like a poor like localization for Yakuza 8 like a dragon, right? Namco Bandai has been exposed for censoring games, making skirts longer and stuff like that. Like, you have all these other companies that are doing things, are making like really radical changes in localization to Japanese products, and yet what everyone tries to do is try to like steer the conversation towards Nintendo. Like, oh, even Nintendo is doing it, even though they're not really doing it to the same extent, right? Like this is an observable thing, and it has been for a long time. Is that like Nintendo is way behind the rest of the industry when it comes to these kind of like westernized gaming practices. And I've been very honest with you about this, right? Where I've said like they're not completely immune to it at this point, but that's mostly because it's so culturally ubiquitous in the West, right? Like you can't really get away from it. So to me, it's not like a really problem with a problem with the company. It's a problem with like American culture, like that desperately needs to be corrected, right? But like for me, it's expecting Nintendo to take a stand against that, fixing our cultural problems is ridiculous. Okay, let's be real about that, right? So like again, like nobody's complaining about like all the woke culture in and of itself, right? Nobody's saying that like the West Coast needs to like grow up a little bit and understand that like their worldview is completely insane. Like nobody's saying that. Like people just Nintendo can't do this. Like really? Like why blame Nintendo for something like the West Coast is doing? Like come on. It's just absurd, right? And we've been seeing this over and over and over again, right? Is just this incessant need to downplay everything Nintendo was doing. Princess Peach Showtime is a really good example of this. I think this also happened with Super Mario Bros. Wonder and Tears of the Kingdom as well, and Legends Arceus, right? Where you had this like giga hit, right? You had this huge, huge success story with this game, and all anybody could do was just sit there and try to tell you that like, oh, it wasn't that successful. It's just a 2D Mario game. It's just a Princess Peach game. Like, we all know that Rise of the Ronin and Dragon's Dogma 2 is going to outperform it, and when they didn't, they downplay and ignore it. Earlier this year they were saying that like, oh, the Switch isn't going to get any major games this year, but we got Unicorn Overlord, we got Princess Peach Showtime, we got Freedom Planet 2, all of which are like straight up Kino. Like I haven't heard a single one of these gaming YouTubers bring up Freedom Planet 2 at all. A game that's like objectively way better than any 2D Sonic game, and yet these people are just seriously trying to come out and tell you that like, oh, there's nothing on Switch. Oh, there's nothing of value on Switch. There's no games on Switch. Like they've been doing this for a long time, but like it's getting more and more blatant. Like with each passing year, I think like everybody just keeps like banging on about how like Nintendo isn't being competitive enough, even when they're dominating the competition, right? It's crazy. Like we have a new Grand Theft Auto game on the horizon, and it really does feel like it's not really going to leave much of a dent in what Nintendo is doing, right? Like it really does feel like this might be the last time that Grand Theft Auto like really steers console sales, because I think like the rest of the industry is in a position where they can put out something that will replace Grand Theft Auto. Like if Grand Theft Auto like refuses to allow you to do the things that uh, players expect, they're releasing all these statements about how they won't let you be a toxic person in the game, right? Like, is it really going to remain popular if they like seriously do that? Like, imagine if you like kill a civilian in Grand Theft Auto and you just immediately go to jail, right? Like, you just get caught by the police and then like you can't post bail. Like, you just kind of sit there and like I don't know for like like 5 years in real time. Like oh, it's more realistic that way. But is that what the audience wants? Right? Is that what like people want from a Grand Theft Auto game? No, they just want to kill cops like indiscriminately, right? They want a Black Lives Matter simulator. So like I think like Grand Theft Auto is not going to like remain competitive like long term because like the older Saints Row games were already better than it. Yakuza was already better than it in certain ways. Like there are like reasonable alternatives. Like the issue is just like Grand Theft Auto is such a huge phenomenon that like even going woke is not going to sink it immediately. Like we saw Disney collapse because of woke culture over the past several decades, right? And I don't think Rockstar Games is immune to that. Like I think one bad release, something like Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to tank their reputation among their audience, right? And it's going to be very very difficult to build it back. And what's more, you have like the superior Nintendo games. And I think like Grand Theft Auto is an extreme example, but I think Final Fantasy is a really good example of what this is going to look like, where you had this culturally like relevant thing, the JRPG franchise in the West, Final Fantasy, right? Like it steered people towards PlayStation. It was a huge deal. Like they made all these new IPs for PlayStation. They completely ignored Nintendo, like for like a decade. Up until like the ports, like for the original Final Fantasy games came out in Game Boy Advance, like they were ignoring Nintendo for a really, really, really long time. They were trying to drive them out of business. They've made statements about how their goal is to sell PlayStations and stuff like that. Like they were such a huge thing for selling PlayStations. Final Fantasy VII is one of the most iconic PlayStation games ever, right? You have all of these games, and what happens, right? Like they slowly start losing their credibility. Like they slowly start putting out bullshit to try to appeal to like the Call of Duty and Fortnite audience, right? They try doing all these things. Their production schedule slows down. They're not able to produce. They're not able to like do anything new and interesting. And like over time, they slowly get overtaken by other companies who do support Nintendo hardware. Falcom is a really good example. The Trails of Cold Steel games has really been um, a weird kind of sleeper hit in the West recently, right? You have, the Xenoblade games, you have Pokemon, you have all these Fire Emblem, you have all these like JRPG alternatives, like culminating, I think, in the release of Dragon Quest XI. A Switch game that kind of that now is considered one of the best RPGs on the platform. Not that I necessarily agree with that, but like it's better than any Final Fantasy game in recent memory, right? Like that's undisputable. So like, Square in their endless pursuit for the PlayStation money, like their support for the PlayStation Nation, they completely collapsed. And now we're seeing them try to justify like Mana being PlayStation exclusive, right? They're doing the same thing but with like a lesser IP. They're hoping that they can recreate the success they had with Octopath Traveler, which, by the way, I'm sure was not intended to be a success. By the way, like they probably put that out there to bomb. They do this like every generation where they release like a product on a Nintendo console that's designed to fail, so they can tell shareholders that like, oh, looks like our audience isn't on Nintendo hardware. But anyway, like it's interesting looking at this interview that they posted where like they're asked about the actually it was just one guy, wasn't it? Yeah, the producer was asked about why the game wasn't coming to Switch, and he kind of like wrung his hands about it where he's just like well actually we talked about it and we were just like we wanted a bigger world, so we went with PS5. It came off as like completely off base, right? Because you're delusional if you think that like the Switch couldn't run like a bigger RPG. Like just look at Tears of the Kingdom, just look at like Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Like you get no benefit from putting a game exclusively on PS5. And that's becoming more and more obvious to the audience, right? Like it's something I've been talking about for a long time, but it's becoming more and more obvious to casual players as well. Like it would make more sense to release this game on the Switch where the audience actually is, because nobody on PlayStation cares about Mana. Nobody on PlayStation cares about Final Fantasy, right? The audience for these kind of Japanese JRPGs, these very traditional classic stuff, it's exclusively on Nintendo hardware. And these companies need to start accepting that and releasing these products where they need to be released.